Hey, I got to see Kenneth Branagh's film All Is True. Now, I had to go drive an hour to see it, but I am so glad I did because now I get to talk to you about it. Hello and welcome to the Our Shakespeare channel, the channel where I talk about Shakespeare from my 21st century American perspective. Now, as I record this video, I've got about 85 or so subscribers, and I would love to bump that up to 100. It really helps me to make new content if I think people are actually watching it. So if you like what I'm doing, make sure you hit the subscribe button, make sure you like this video, but most importantly, if you have something to say about something that I've said, please put a comment below because that keeps the conversation going, and I will be sure to respond to it as quickly as I possibly can. But enough about that. Let's talk about Kenneth Branagh's film All Is True, where Kenneth Branagh directs and stars and plays the character of William Shakespeare in his later years. William Shakespeare has retired from writing and has returned to his home in Stratford-upon-Avon in the year 1613 after his last play called All Is True, aka Henry VIII, burned down the Globe Theatre. Shakespeare has returned home and is trying to set up a life at home in Stratford with his family. So let's talk about this film. We'll talk about the good, we'll talk about the bad, we'll talk about the mixed, and then I will give a final verdict. So let's chat. First of all, the good. And there is a lot of good in this movie, but the thing that really stands out for me first and foremost is the performances. The acting in this movie is really, really solid. And props to Kenneth Branagh because he really disappeared into the role. Maybe it's because under the prosthetics he looked a lot like Ben Kingsley. I totally forgot that I was watching Kenneth Branagh throughout this film and that he was directing himself. So did Judi Dench as Anne Hathaway, Shakespeare's wife. She was fantastic, beautiful performance, but who would expect anything else from Judi Dench? And then another standout in the film was Sir Ian Mckellen, who is not in the movie as much as I had hoped, but he really makes his mark in a pivotal scene in the film thematically. I think he does a wonderful job in the film as the Earl of Southampton, gives a beautiful performance, even though as an actor he's a bit older than that character likely would have been in Shakespeare's lifetime at that time. But I'm splitting hairs. He gave a beautiful performance, as did the entire cast. And the rest of the supporting cast as well. There really were not any weaknesses from my perspective. And the next thing that stood out for me was the character arcs for each of the major characters. William Shakespeare, Anne Hathaway, and in particularly their daughter Judith, all had excellent, complex arcs throughout the story. So did, to a lesser extent, their daughter Susanna. It wasn't just a film about William Shakespeare. It was very much a film about his family dealing with him being home. And I really appreciated that the screenplay gave complete character arcs to several characters. A third thing that really stood out to me in this film was the cinematography. Really, every shot is a beautiful just picture. You could just pause the film anywhere and hang the picture on the wall. It was really quite stunning and really did a nice job of setting up the place, the characters, the story, and was just really nice to look at. In addition to it being pretty and well framed, I loved that there were long takes. And not only just long takes, but there were moments to breathe. There were some fairly long takes of silence, which for people who get a little antsy, you know, might have been a little bit too much for people, but I personally loved it. I loved that we had moments of the characters thinking, of the characters reflecting, and sometimes just moments to establish the place. A really, really pretty film to look at. Also, the Shakespeare scholar in me really appreciated that the things that we do actually know about William Shakespeare, which are few and far between, but the things that we do know about Shakespeare's later life were included in this, as well as shout outs to a lot of kind of fun biographical facts about William Shakespeare that were sprinkled in when characters reflected on William Shakespeare and his legacy. I think the film did a nice job of making it very clear that the people who were making the film do know William Shakespeare and do appreciate him, and I liked that. The things that we know were there. Another thing I really liked about this film was its themes. It was a very complex movie thematically. Obviously, with a title like All Is True, you're going to probably suspect that there's going to be a lot here about the concept of truth, and that is indeed the case. It was a very complex picture of what is truth as it relates to these characters and their lives and who they are and how they live and how they develop. But also William Shakespeare's understanding of his past and his present and perhaps his future is also in there, as well as the theme of retirement and what do you do with your legacy once you stop doing the thing that gave you that legacy. And I feel like the themes in this movie are themes that are good whether or not the character of Shakespeare is involved. I feel like the themes in this film could have been explored even with a totally fictionalized character. But of course, by making it William Shakespeare, it brings an extra level of depth and raises the stakes. But I think the themes in the play are I think the themes in the film are universal and really nicely teased out over the course of this film. And the last totally positive thing that I will say about this film is that I really liked how this film painted a picture of the cultural and religious life of Stratford-upon-Avon in this particular time. The politics and the religion especially became a part of the story and how William Shakespeare's family progressed throughout the film, and I really liked that. I felt like there was a life outside of the character of Shakespeare himself, and we had a sense of the community in addition to his family. And so kudos for that. All right, so no film is perfect, and there are definitely some things in this film that I would say are on the bad side. And I don't like to say that because I really like Kenneth Branagh. I love Shakespeare, obviously. I do think it's a beautiful film, but there are definitely some things that prevent this film from being perfect. The first, and the thing that jumped out at me earliest in the film, was some of the dialogue. And even though I like the screenplay a lot as a whole, some of the dialogue, particularly in the first act of the film when we're getting a lot of exposition, some of the dialogue felt really on the nose and really lacking in subtext. Like people would literally just say exactly what they are thinking and would literally spell out a metaphor for the sake of the character that they probably wouldn't say in real life, but they're really saying for the audience to make sure we get the metaphor. And it was sometimes a little bit on the nose, and many films fall victim to this. However, there were also some moments where a character would say something to another character that character would already know, but really that character is saying it for our sake. And there was a lot of that in the first third of this film, and I noticed it, and it bugged me a little bit more than it does in some other films. Another negative thing that I will say about this film, which is true of most biopics, is that because it is a biography movie, it's talking about, the last few years of Shakespeare's life, we don't really get a plot in the traditional dramatic structure sense. What we really get is more like a journey, a series of events in chronological order that are related to each other because they happen chronologically, and they're strung together in a thematic way quite nicely, but we don't have necessarily the whole rising action, climax, falling action. It didn't feel like the story was driving anywhere at all times. Sometimes it meandered a bit. Sometimes there were ups that felt like the movie was coming to a climax, and then it would kind of drop down for a while. It just didn't. The pacing was sometimes a little bit off, and I think not because Kenneth Branagh, as the director, paced it poorly as a director, but I just think that the screenplay, as a biography film, did not lend itself to a tight dramatic structure. Okay, one thing that really bothered me upon reflection, and I didn't really notice it in the moment, but when I was in the car on the 1-hour drive home from the theater, I started thinking about, and actually speaking with my wife about, the character of Susanna in the film and her husband. These are characters who in the first half of the film are set up as major characters. There is an arc and a relationship started for them. The film focuses very heavily on their relationship and their relationship to William Shakespeare, and then about halfway through the film they don't disappear, but where the film seemed to be taking them, it just kind of dissipated. And it seemed like the movie, the screenplay, forgot about them and didn't fully resolve the journey of those characters to the same extent that it resolved the other characters. It almost felt like maybe there were some scenes that got deleted that I think would have helped to clarify a couple of things later in the film. There seemed to be some big jumps in their characters' behavior from one scene to a later scene without any connective tissue in between to show us why the behavior was the way it was. And so for those characters especially, there were some things that were not clearly explained, and there were some character journey that wasn't really earned, and that was a little bit disappointing to me, because I feel like especially Anne and Judith and William Shakespeare, their characters had such nicely drawn arcs, and I thought we were going to get the same thing for Susanna and her husband, and it just didn't quite pan out that way. And then my last negative, which is tied to what I was just talking about, is that there were some plot points in the story that were not really clearly laid out exactly what people's motivations were or why certain things were happening. And I would like to say that the screenplay and Kenneth Branagh, the director, just trusted that the audience would get it, except it's very clear early in the film that they don't always trust that the audience is going to know everything about what's happening, because they sometimes lay things out so clearly and without subtext early in the film that when things happen later in the film that aren't really explained, that can be a little bit frustrating and jarring. And so there were a couple of moments like that, and I don't want to get into too much detail because I don't want to spoil anything. Okay, so now to the things that I don't want to categorize as good or bad, because they are good and bad. And one of those things is that since we don't know all that much about William Shakespeare's actual life, the film has to fill in an awful lot of gaps about William Shakespeare's life in order to make a compelling story, which it does, but it has to make a lot of stuff up just completely out of the blue in order to piece together the few things that we do know that are present in the story. Most of those things that they fill in, I was totally on board for. I thought, wow, that's a really interesting thing you did there. Really great. The last 15 minutes of the film, though, they fill in a gap in a certain element of Shakespeare's biography in a way that I found really kind of lazy and not really interesting or compelling. And when it happened, I was like, really? This is how you're going to do this? Okay. And I didn't really buy into that one particular thing. I found that one particular thing, which I don't want to spoil, to be unsatisfying. For the most part, though, the gaps that they filled in Shakespeare's life, I think they did a nice job with, and I think I was totally on board for. And the second mixed thing I will say before moving on to my summary is that this is clearly a film that is made now in the 21st century. Not that it is anachronistic, but that it chooses to focus on the dynamics of gender and sexuality in that culture in a way that you might not have focused on that in another time in our history. The movie ends up giving very mixed messages in what we in the 21st century are to take away from that. So that's neither good nor bad for me, but just I think there's maybe a little bit of a lack of clarity there. There's a lot that this movie spells out very clearly, and this is not necessarily one of them. Okay, so now I'll summarize my thoughts. This is a beautifully acted, beautifully shot film that explores some interesting themes and characters and does a nice job painting the later life of William Shakespeare, but it's not without some flaws, some of them fairly serious flaws in my mind, especially upon reflection. As a teacher, I'm going to give it a letter grade, and I will give it a B-. It's a film that I would personally happily watch again. It's a film that I would recommend to people who like William Shakespeare and to people who enjoy history and literature and who enjoy biopics, but maybe it's not a film for mass audiences. But if you like this sort of thing, maybe you should check it out. Thanks for watching my review. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you like the video. If you haven't subscribed to my channel, be sure to do that. Ring the little bell if you want to get notified every month or so when I drop a new video. And for now, fare thee well. I commend you to your own content.